In the depths of hidden truths and buried secrets lies a haunting story. The case of Janet Luxford, whose life was violently cut short, and Brian Jones, the man who held on to dark truths for over 2 decades, is a chilling journey through love, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of justice. In this story, we unveil the fractured pieces of Janet's life and her tragic end, piecing together a mystery that haunted a family and stunned a town. Here, we present titles capturing the essence of this grim tale, followed by powerful 3-word summaries to keep the memory alive.
Janet Luxford was like a whisper in the lives of those around her, gentle, kind-hearted, and filled with a quiet strength. In February 2001, she took a bold step that would alter the course of her life. She left Jacksonville, Florida, to be with her boyfriend, Brian Edward Jones, in Bessemer, Alabama. Family and friends sensed her excitement, but also an underlying tension. Janet was chasing love, a dream she believed could bring her the happiness she'd sought for so long. But as she left her hometown, a sense of foreboding seemed to cloud her every step. Her daughter, just a teenager at the time, watched her mother leave, a mix of emotions twisting in her heart. Janet's disappearance left a void, an aching absence that her daughter would carry for years. Weeks passed without a word from Janet. Her family grew uneasy, filling the silence with hopeful words and reassurances. But the optimism was short-lived. Every phone call that didn't come, every message that remained unanswered, chipped away at their hope. Janet was becoming a ghost, a memory too soon after she'd left. Days turned into months, and the family's worst fears began to surface. Janet's daughter finally reported her missing in September 2002. Law enforcement took note, but the trail had already grown cold. Every clue, every potential lead, seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving the Luxford family with only questions and sleepless nights. They replayed every memory of her departure, every word of her last conversation, desperate for something they might have missed, a sign, a warning. Meanwhile, Brian Jones went about his life with unsettling normalcy. To those who knew him, he was unremarkable, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But beneath this facade lay a chilling darkness. The passing years had done little to erode the truth, buried deep within his conscience. His silence was deafening, a heavy weight that grew with every passing day. The mystery of Janet Luxford remained untouched, haunting the lives of those she left behind. The town of Bessemer held its own secrets, wrapped tightly around the memories of the day Janet arrived. The streets she'd walked, the places she'd visited with Brian all bore silent witness to the beginning of a tragedy. And somewhere in the shadows, the truth lay waiting. The suitcase containing her remains would not surface for decades. Until then, Janet's life and death would remain a mystery, lost in the folds of time and secrecy. For years, Janet's daughter lived with the pain of not knowing. She clung to memories, to fleeting moments when her mother's smile had lit up the room. Janet had been more than a mother. She'd been a friend, a confidant. Each day without answers was a wound that refused to heal. And yet, she waited, hoping against hope that someday, somehow, her mother's story would be told. But time is relentless, and the memory of Janet began to fade in the minds of others. Friends moved on, her story becoming a faint recollection, a sad footnote in conversations. Yet, for her family, the pain was as fresh as the day she vanished. The case grew cold, boxed away in police archives. Still, her daughter never gave up. She fought for her mother's memory, determined that one day, justice would prevail. As the years wore on, the case of Janet Luxford drifted into the shadows, an unsolved mystery that haunted those who remembered. But the world moved on, indifferent to the quiet tragedy. Brian Jones, the man she had loved, was never truly free. He carried his secret with him, a burden that festered like an open wound. He tried to bury it, but the past has a way of catching up with those who try to outrun it. It would take 2 decades before the silence surrounding Janet's fate would be broken. Until then, her spirit lingered, watching over her daughter, who had never stopped searching for her. The town of Bessemer moved on, the people oblivious to the darkness hidden just beneath the surface. But some scars never fade, and some questions refused to be silenced. In the quiet moments, when Brian was alone, the ghost of Janet Luxford would emerge, a shadow that refused to be ignored. Each reminder of her haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. For years, he had evaded justice, believing he could escape his past. But in the end, the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deep it's buried. Finally, in March 2022, after 2 decades of silence, Brian Jones returned to Bessemer. The journey was long and heavy, each mile a reminder of the dark truth he could no longer carry alone. When he walked into the police station, his heart pounded, a mix of fear and resignation. He knew that his confession would bring an end to the mystery, but also to his freedom. He was ready to face the consequences of his actions. Brian's confession was chilling, a tale of anger and violence that had taken Janet's life. He claimed it had been an accident, a strike in the heat of an argument. But there was no undoing the horror he had unleashed. For Janet's family, the confession was both a relief and a new wound, reopening the pain they had lived with for so many years. And as the police led Brian to the site he had hidden for all these years, the truth began to emerge, piece by piece. Janet's final resting place, hidden so close yet so far from the life she had left behind, held the answers her family had longed for. The silence was finally shattered, the mystery unraveling under the weight of Brian's confession. The road to Janet's final resting place was cold and unwelcoming. Brian walked with law enforcement down the familiar streets of Bessemer, his footsteps heavy with guilt. As he led them to a secluded area near Harmer Street and Valley Creek, he knew that this would be his last time revisiting the site he tried to forget. Here, amidst the brush and trees, he had left Janet. The guilt had eaten away at him, his every moment haunted by her memory. It was a chilling scene. The officers' expressions were grim as they unearthed the suitcase, buried under layers of dirt and time. Inside were Janet's remains, silent testimony to a crime that had remained hidden for far too long. Forensic teams handled the remains carefully, as though Janet herself might speak, finally able to tell her story. Each bone, each fragment was a reminder of the life that had been stolen, the love that had been betrayed. Janet's family watched the news in stunned silence, emotions tearing at their hearts. Her daughter, now an adult, felt both grief and relief. The years of wondering, of hoping for answers, had finally come to an end. But with it came the realization of the horror her mother had endured. The grief was sharper, more intense than ever, as the details of Brian's confession became public. Knowing the truth was painful, but it was also a release from the torment of not knowing. The courtroom was silent as Brian Jones stood before the judge, his face drawn and pale. His years of silence had come to an end, and he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. His confession had spared the family a lengthy trial, but the pain remained. Janet's daughter was there, her eyes fixed on the man who had taken her mother from her. She was determined to bear witness, to ensure that her mother's memory would not be erased. Brian's sentence was symbolic: 21 years for the 21 years that Janet's family had spent in limbo. The judge's words were measured, but there was an unspoken understanding of the pain this crime had inflicted. For Janet's family, it was a moment of justice, but also a reminder of all they had lost. Brian was led away, and with him went the darkness that had haunted the Luxford family for so long. Yet, even with Brian's confession, questions lingered. How had he lived with himself all these years? What had driven him to confess after so long? The truth, as he told it, was that he'd struck her in a fit of rage, a blow that had ended her life in an instant. But for Janet's family, this explanation felt hollow, a poor attempt to justify an act of unspeakable violence. They would never fully understand what happened that night, but they had come as close as they ever would. The town of Bessemer was shaken, haunted by the revelation that a woman had lain hidden in their midst for over 2 decades. People whispered about Brian, about the life he'd led, pretending that nothing had happened. Janet's story became a somber reminder of the darkness that can lie beneath ordinary lives. And though justice had come, the town would never be quite the same. As Janet's remains were finally laid to rest, her family gathered, honoring the memory of the woman they had loved and lost. The funeral was a quiet affair, a moment of closure that was both painful and healing. Her daughter spoke, her words filled with love, honoring the mother who had meant so much to her. Janet had been many things: mother, friend, a source of light. She would never be forgotten. For her daughter, the journey was far from over. She had spent years seeking answers, fighting to keep her mother's memory alive. Now, with Janet laid to rest, she found herself navigating a new chapter, one where justice had been served, but the pain remained. The years of searching, of fighting for answers, had taken a toll. Yet, in this moment, she found peace, knowing her mother was finally at rest. Brian Jones's story faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale of love twisted into something dark and destructive. His life, once intertwined with Janet's, was now a testament to the weight of guilt, of secrets kept and lives shattered. His confession had brought an end to the mystery, but at a cost that could never be repaid. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the memory of the woman he had loved and lost in the most tragic way. In the quiet that followed, Janet's family found solace in each other, bound together by the memory of the woman they had loved. They would remember her smile, her kindness, the light she had brought to their lives. And though the scars would remain, they knew that Janet's story had finally found its ending. The case of Janet Luxford remains a reminder of the resilience of those left behind, of the strength it takes to search for the truth when all hope seems lost. For Janet's daughter, life would go on, forever marked by the memory of her mother. But in the quiet moments, she would feel Janet's presence, a reminder that love endures, even in the face of unimaginable loss. And as the world moved on, the memory of Janet Luxford lived on in the hearts of those who knew her, a quiet testament to a life interrupted but never forgotten. In the end, her story had been told, and the truth, no matter how painful, had set her free.
Okay, get ready, because this deep dive takes us into a mystery that chilled a small town for over 20 years, the disappearance of Janet Luxford. We've got newspaper articles and first-hand accounts from people who knew her, even court documents. It's a puzzle. We're going to try to piece it all together.
What strikes me right away is how long this case went unsolved. Over 20 years, Janet's family was left wondering. We'll be talking about not just the timeline of the events, but also all that psychological baggage that comes with a mystery like this for everyone involved, really.
Right. It's February 2001. Imagine you're Janet Luxford, a woman described by everyone who knew her as gentle and kind. And you've decided to start fresh, moving from Jacksonville, Florida to Bessemer, Alabama to be with your boyfriend, Brian Jones. New town, new love. Should be exciting.
You'd think so, but even in the early accounts, you can sense this undercurrent of unease. I mean, Janet's family was happy for her, of course, but there were these whispers of worry, almost like a premonition. It's common, though, in these kinds of stories, isn't it? That feeling that something is not quite right, but you just can't put your finger on it.
Like that knot in your stomach you get when you're watching, like a horror movie, knowing something bad is about to happen. And sadly, in Janet's case, that unease was justified. Just a few months after the move, she goes silent. No more calls to her family back in Florida, no letters, nothing. Poof, vanished.
And that silence, that's the real killer. The not knowing, it just eats away at you. Think about it. If one of your loved ones just suddenly disappeared without a trace, how would you cope with that uncertainty?
Honestly, I can't even imagine the mental torture of just not knowing. It must be agonizing, especially for Janet's daughter, who was only a teenager at the time. I mean, your mom disappears and it's like she just ceased to exist.
It's a trauma that leaves scars, for sure. We'll talk about the impact on Janet's family later, but for now, let's stick to the facts. A missing person report is filed in September 2002, but the case runs cold. Fast forward 20 years, 2 decades of silence.
And then, out of the blue, in March 2022, Brian Jones, Janet's boyfriend, walks into the Bessemer police station and confesses to her murder. It's like something out of a movie. What would possess someone to confess after all those years? What was he thinking?
This is where the psychology gets really interesting. We're talking about someone who's carried this dark secret for decades. Why now? Was it guilt, gnawing at his conscience? Or did something happen in his life that forced him to confront his past, maybe a near-death experience? Or, a sudden religious awakening. We often see delayed confessions, triggered by seemingly unrelated events.
So it's like he was living this double life outwardly, just an ordinary guy in Bessemer, but inside carrying this immense burden.
Exactly. And to unpack that, we need to dive into the psychology of someone who commits a crime and then just conceals it. For years, there's a whole field of study dedicated to criminal behavior,
Yeah.
And delayed confessions, well, they're a real head-scratcher, even for experts. One theory is that these individuals suppress their guilt. They bury it deep down, so they can function. It's like a coping mechanism, a way to avoid facing the weight of their actions.
So their mind is trying to protect itself from that unbearable truth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that buried guilt can manifest itself in all sorts of ways. Anxiety, nightmares, even physical ailments with no apparent cause. Think about it. If you were carrying a secret that heavy, wouldn't it start to affect you, your mental and physical well-being?
Absolutely. The stress alone would be crippling. So in Jones's case, what do we know about the confession itself?
Well, according to police reports, his account it's chillingly simple, actually. He claims that he and Janet had this heated argument. He flew into a rage, struck her, and she died. Then panic. He packs her body into a suitcase and buries her in this secluded area near Harmer Street and Valley Creek.
And just like that, a life is gone. But then he goes on living as if nothing happened. How does someone even begin to reconcile that in their mind?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Did he truly believe that he could just bury the past along with the body? Or was he living in constant fear of being discovered?
I mean, it's not like you can just forget about it. There had to be some level of awareness, of guilt, eating away at him all those years.
You would think so. And for Janet's family, who had been desperately searching for answers, this confession must have been a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, they had an answer to the question that had haunted them for so long: what happened to Janet? But the truth, as it often does, came with a heavy price. They now knew the horrific circumstances of her death.
It's like a bittersweet victory. They finally have closure, but it's a closure that reveals a darker truth than they could ever imagine. And after 2 decades of holding on to hope, they have to confront the reality that their loved one was murdered by someone they trusted.
That level of betrayal adds another layer of complexity to an already heartbreaking situation. We've talked about the psychology of the perpetrator, but we can't forget about the trauma endured by the victim's family. The sudden disappearance of a loved one, followed by years of uncertainty, can have devastating psychological and emotional consequences. Imagine the constant questioning, the guilt, the endless what-ifs. It's a heavy burden to carry.
Absolutely. And in Janet's case, her daughter was just a child when her mother vanished. Can you imagine growing up with that void in your life, that unanswered question hanging over you?
It's unimaginable. The not knowing, the lack of closure, it can stunt your emotional growth, leaving you frozen in a state of perpetual grief and uncertainty. And then, when the truth finally emerges, it can shatter the world you've built around that absence.
It's like having the foundation of your life ripped out from under you. Everything you thought you knew, all those years of speculation and wondering, suddenly become irrelevant in the face of this harsh reality.
Exactly. And that's why support systems are so crucial in these cases. family, friends, therapists, support groups. Everyone needs a network to help them navigate the complex journey of grief, healing, and reconciliation.
It's a reminder that even in the face of such tragedy, we don't have to go through it alone. There are people who understand, people who can offer a shoulder to cry on, a listening ear, and guidance on how to move forward.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that healing is a process, not a destination. It takes time, it takes effort, and it often involves setbacks and difficult emotions. But with the right support, individuals and families can find ways to cope, to honor the memory of their loved ones, and to move forward in a way that feels healthy and meaningful.
We're talking about a confession, a buried body, a family just desperate for answers. It's like something out of, a true crime documentary. But let's not forget, this isn't just a story. These are real people, real lives, just shattered by this horrific event. And after Jones's confession, the case took another unexpected turn.
Right, because a confession doesn't automatically equal a conviction. In Janet's case, Jones led the police to that secluded area near Harmer Street and Valley Creek where he'd buried her remains all those years ago. Imagine being one of those officers, digging up a suitcase in the woods, knowing what they're likely to find. Inside, it must be surreal and somber.
It's like something out of a nightmare. But as grim as it is, finding Janet's remains was crucial for several reasons, right?
Absolutely. First and foremost, it brought a sense of closure to Janet's family. It allowed them to finally lay her to rest properly. Remember, they had endured over 2 decades of not knowing her fate. That's an incredibly heavy burden to carry.
It's like a wound that can't heal because you don't even know the extent of the damage. The not knowing is often the hardest part.
Exactly. And beyond the emotional closure, the discovery of Janet's remains was also vital from a forensic standpoint. It provided physical evidence that could be examined, analyzed, compared to Jones's confession. Remember, even with a confession, investigators need to corroborate the details, ensure that everything lines up.
So it's like putting together a puzzle. The confession is a big piece, but you still need the other pieces to complete the picture. And sometimes those other pieces, they can reveal inconsistencies or challenge the confessor's version of events.
Precisely. Forensic evidence can be a powerful tool for validating or refuting aspects of a confession. In Janet's case, the examination of her remains could potentially reveal details about the cause of death, the time frame, other factors that might corroborate or contradict Jones's account. It adds another layer of complexity and intrigue to an already fascinating case.
It's like those forensic shows you see on TV, where they use science to uncover the hidden truths. Except this isn't fiction, right? This is real life with real consequences.
Exactly. And in cases like this, where so much time has passed, forensic science plays a crucial role in piecing together the past and ensuring that justice is served. Remember, justice doesn't have an expiration date.
Right. And while the wheels of justice might grind slowly, they do eventually turn. In this case, Brian Jones, after confessing to Janet's murder and leading authorities to her remains, was sentenced to 21 years in prison. That's a year for every year Janet was missing. The symbolism there is pretty powerful, wouldn't you say?
It is. It speaks to the gravity of the crime and the attempt by the justice system to impose a sentence that reflects the magnitude of the loss and the suffering endured by Janet's family. But it also raises questions about the complexities of sentencing, especially in cases involving delayed confessions.
So if you were on the jury, would you feel that 21 years is a just sentence? Or would you grapple with the fact that he confessed, albeit after 2 decades of silence? It's a tough call, isn't it? Trying to balance punishment with the circumstances surrounding the confession.
Absolutely. There's no easy answer in these situations. Every case is unique, and judges and juries, they have to weigh a multitude of factors. The severity of the crime, the defendant's remorse, the impact on the victim's family, the passage of time, and the potential for rehabilitation. It's a complex equation with no perfect solution.
And in this case, there wasn't even a full trial, right? Because Jones confessed. They didn't need to go through the whole process of presenting evidence and arguing the case before a jury.
That's correct. In many jurisdictions, a confession can significantly expedite the legal process, especially if the confession is deemed credible and is corroborated by other evidence. It can lead to a plea bargain, where the defendant agrees to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, or, as in Jones's case, a straightforward sentencing hearing.
So in a way, his confession, while providing closure for Janet's family, also served as a shortcut in the legal system. It expedited the process and potentially resulted in a lighter sentence than if he had gone to trial and been found guilty.
That's a possibility. But it's also important to consider the psychological impact of a confession. on the defendant themselves. For some, confessing, even after years of concealment, can bring a sense of relief, a release from the burden of guilt they've been carrying. It's almost like a form of self-punishment, a way of acknowledging the wrong they've committed and seeking some form of redemption.
So for those who believe in the concept of karma, his confession could be seen as the first step in a long journey of atonement. Whether he truly feels remorse or is simply seeking to alleviate his own guilt, the act of confessing can be a powerful catalyst for personal transformation.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, there's always potential for change, for growth, and for finding meaning in the face of past mistakes.
Okay, so we've talked about the confession, the forensic evidence, the sentencing, but throughout all of this, there's one element that keeps nagging at me. Why did Brian Jones wait 20 years to come clean? What happened during those 2 decades that finally pushed him to confess?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. We can speculate, we can analyze the available information, but we might never fully comprehend the inner workings of his mind, the complex interplay of emotions, motivations, and circumstances that led to this delayed confession.
It's like we're trying to solve a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. We have the pieces, but we might never fully understand how they fit together.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes these cases so fascinating, so compelling. They force us to confront the limitations of our understanding, the gray areas of human behavior, and the enduring mystery of the human heart.
But amidst all the speculation, let's not forget the impact on Janet's family. They finally got answers, but at what cost? I can't even imagine the emotional roller coaster they went through, reliving the trauma, facing the man who took their loved one away.
You're right. We have to acknowledge the profound emotional toll this took on Janet's family, especially her daughter. Imagine growing up without your mother, not knowing what happened to her, and then suddenly, 2 decades later, the truth comes crashing down. It's like having your world turned upside down, forcing you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew.
It must have been like a punch to the gut, bringing back all those years of pain and uncertainty. But now with the added weight of knowing the horrific truth and then having to face Jones in court, to see the man who took her mother away, it's a level of emotional turmoil that's hard to comprehend.
Absolutely. And that's where the importance of support systems comes into play again. Surrounding yourself with loved ones, seeking professional help, finding healthy ways to cope with the trauma. These are all crucial steps in the healing process.
Because healing isn't a linear process. It's messy, it's complicated, and it takes time. There will be good days and bad days, moments of anger, moments of peace. But with the right support, it is possible to find a way to move forward, to honor Janet's memory, and to rebuild a life that feels meaningful.
Beautifully said. And in the midst of all this darkness, there's a glimmer of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Janet's daughter, despite the unimaginable trauma she endured, never gave up hope. She never stopped searching for answers. And ultimately, her perseverance played a role in bringing her mother's story to light.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, love and hope can prevail, and that sometimes justice, while delayed, can still be served, bringing a measure of closure and peace to those who have suffered.
And it underscores the importance of never giving up on the search for truth, no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult the path. Janet's story serves as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the unwavering pursuit of justice.
We've covered a lot of ground in Janet's case: the disappearance, the wait for answers, the shock of that confession, and the relief of finding her remains. It's a story that raises more questions than it answers, but at the heart of it all is Janet Luxford, a woman whose life was cut short. How do we make sure that she's remembered, not just as a victim, but as a person?
That's such an important point. It's so easy for cases like this to become, abstract, to just focus on the crime, the investigation, the psychology. But we can't forget the human cost. Janet was a daughter, a mother, a friend. She had dreams, aspirations, a whole life that was just stolen from her. It's crucial to remember that behind every headline, every case file, there's a real person whose story deserves to be told.
And for her family, that act of remembering, keeping her memory alive, it becomes a way of honoring her life, ensuring that she's not defined by this tragedy. They held a funeral for Janet after her remains were found, a moment of closure, a chance to say goodbye. What role do those rituals play in the healing process, especially after such a long period of uncertainty?
Rituals, like funerals, memorials, they're powerful. They're tools for processing grief and loss. They provide a space for mourning, for remembrance, for finding meaning in the face of tragedy. For Janet's family, after 20 years of not knowing, the funeral was a way to finally lay her to rest, to acknowledge the pain of her absence, to celebrate the life she lived. It's a way of saying you're gone, but you are not forgotten.
It's like a punctuation mark. At the end of a long and painful chapter, it doesn't erase the pain, but it helps to create a sense of order, of resolution, in a situation that has felt so chaotic and unresolved for so long.
Exactly. And it also reminds us that even in death, there's beauty, there's love, and there's this enduring power of human connection.
But even with the funeral, the sentencing, the closure of the case, some questions might linger. Why did Brian Jones do it? What was going through his mind all those years? Was he really remorseful? Or was his confession, driven by something else, some other motive?
Those are questions that might haunt Janet's family, probably forever. Unfortunately, there are just no easy answers. We can speculate, we can analyze the evidence, but we might never fully understand, the complexities of human behavior, the dark parts of the human heart.
It's like trying to read a book where some pages are just missing. You get the gist, but there are gaps, missing pieces that make you wonder, what really happened? And in this case, those missing pieces might just stay a mystery forever.
That's true. But even without all the answers, I think we can still learn from Janet's story. It reminds us to be empathetic, to be compassionate, and to understand the ripple effects of violence. It also highlights, the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and that unwavering pursuit of justice, even when it takes decades to achieve.
And for you, our listener, we leave you with this thought. If you were in Brian Jones's shoes, carrying a secret like that for 20 years, what would break you? What would make you confess? And how do you think Janet's family found the strength to keep going, to keep searching for answers all those years? It's a real testament to the power of the human spirit to just persevere, even when facing unimaginable loss and heartbreak. Janet's story, though tragic, is a reminder that hope and love can endure, even the darkest of times.